Hello, and welcome to the Colaba Conversation, organized by the Observer Research Foundation and in collaboration with the government of Maharashtra, where we've assembled an excellent panel for you today to talk about something that's absolutely vital from the point of view of Mumbai, the place where the Colaba Conversations are hosted, but not just Mumbai, but all Indian cities, and in fact, many, many cities across the emerging world. And that is, how is it that we can build our cities back to deal with the new stresses and tensions that they will face in an age of rampant climate change, in an age of pressure on other forms of sustainable development, and of course, in an age when we're all struggling to recover from the global pandemic. One of the crucial questions that we will be examining during this panel is how resilience is being built into cities in India and across the emerging world in the face of these three challenges, and also how is it that these new developments that we need to see in urbanism, in urban planning, and in how we think about our cities can be financed. What is the public sector's role? How can we bring the private sector into managing resilience? And all of these are very big questions and um, uh, uh, relatively important, in fact, if we need to think about the growth of our countries and livability in our cities going forward. And we have an excellent panel, as I said, and I'm going to introduce them one by one as I turn to them for opening remarks. And I'm going to start with Jagan Shah, who's resident senior fellow at the IDFC Institute in India, which of course is one of our leading think tanks, if not the leading think tank on urban issues, and it is based out of Mumbai. Um, Jagan, do you have any initial thoughts that you'd like to share with us on this subject?
I do, Mihir. Thanks very much, and thanks very much for that generous introduction to the IDFC Institute. We are extremely pleased to hear that. I think with regard to the themes that you've set out, Mihir, this is a subject of great urgency, especially because a country like India is building a pipeline of $1.3 trillion worth of infrastructure, out of which about 20% or so is going to be in urban areas. So this couldn't come at a better time. I want to actually focus on a couple of things. One is that I think what the COVID pandemic has taught us is a sort of a crash course in vulnerabilities, to understand the city as a location of vulnerability and risk. We've seen this from the perspective of social justice. If you look at what happened with migrants and their lack of access to transportation, in fact, during the lockdown, they were just left sort of high and dry. We've looked at situations like livelihoods, especially home-based workers, small enterprises, the way in which they were impacted by lockdowns, but not only lockdowns, also restrictions on movements of workers. And importantly, the way in which this has impacted the growth and prosperity prospects of cities, especially large metropolitan regions like the Mumbai region and Delhi and Calcutta, Bangalore and others. Especially the way that it has impacted labor markets, the access of labor to workplace, the access of even white-collar workers to their workplaces, and the impacts of digitalization, which has, in a sense, willy-nilly entered our lives in a much bigger way through this last 18 to 20 months. I think climate change has exacerbated all of these, whether you look at social justice or you look at livelihoods and growth, mainly because of the intermittent but increasing frequency of climate-related events. And this only puts greater pressure and adds to the vulnerability of local populations. I'll just end with a thought of how this might then be linked to the question about private capital and investment. I think my colleague Haim will talk about risk, and so I won't dwell on that. But since CDRI is an organization that's looking at it much deeply, but I want to just highlight the importance of planning per se. And you also mentioned it in your opening remark. And I think this is now a sort of a clarion call for us to make sure that we are actually emphasizing the role of planning, spatial, physical planning, economic planning, in the way in which our urbanization is taking place in a country like India. Planning is a lot about demand management, and the private sector investment is led by demand. So if we want to lock in the private sector's investment in our cities, not only do we need to allay their fears about risk and risk allocation, but also importantly, to look at how demand can be linked with the location and operation of infrastructure. I'll just pause there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jagan. And I think that, as you say, we're going to be returning to the issues of risk in particular and managing demand later on in this conversation. I now turn to Lubaina Ranwala, who is the program head for urban development, sustainable cities and transport at the World Resources Institute, India. And WRI has been leading the charge in increasing awareness and capacity to manage resilience in many urban centers in India today. And we're very happy to have Lubaina here to share her initial thoughts on the agenda.
Thank you, Mihir. Thanks for the introduction. So just to sort of focus more on the aspect of sustainable infrastructure, I think what I'd really what I've been thinking about, and with a lot of my recent work on the Mumbai Climate Action Plan that we're supporting BMC with, what we are sort of focusing on is more the big infrastructure projects, and where I think really, also kind of chiming in with what Jagan was saying, it's really important to think about solutions from a more holistic point of view. So if Mumbai, for example, is now building the metro network across the city, what is really important to also kind of understand and read and acknowledge is that they have multimodal integration plans that are now webbed into the contracting process. So when a project is given out to the consultant, there is a broader kind of opportunity that gets laid out, because big infrastructure projects are bringing in the finance into cities. And how can we then think about issues of accessibility, of inclusion, better access to public spaces, etc., as part of these kinds of infrastructure projects. Similarly, thinking about a lot of work that is also happening sort of on the resilience adaptation side. Like in Mumbai, one of the biggest challenges is flooding. A lot of big infrastructure projects are being, like, you have the holding tanks, and a lot of grey infrastructure projects are being planned to deal with aspects of flooding. How can nature-based solutions then become part of that planning process, wherein then the opportunity, so there are, these are some of the softer aspects of infrastructure and planning that actually mostly get missed out, or are less attractive, and therefore there are finance gaps that cities face. So how can you think about including and integrating some of these into the ways in which contracts and DPRs are written on big infrastructure projects is, I think, a good opportunity for cities to think about, more sustained financing. The other piece is also the opportunity for integration. I think what a lot of challenges that have been thrown at us in the last 2 years, whether it is the experience of the pandemic and what it really required for cities to come together across departments, jurisdictions, decentralize when needed, centralize and make decisions more with more agility when required. What it has taught us is that we can deal with agility and more of a sort of appropriate response when required. And I think that's a lot of what climate adaptation and mitigation is needed. Bringing in, say, 2 or 3 different institutions or departments together to think about more holistic solutions. So I'll just stop at this, and yeah, we can pick these up later.
Thanks, Lubaina. And now we'll hear from Olga Chepelianskaia, who's a founding director of UNICITI, which works across Asia on embedding sustainability into urban planning. Olga, if you can go ahead.
Thank you, Mihir. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's all the more my pleasure to be here, as I absolutely love Colaba. Whenever I visit Mumbai, that's the place I try to go first. A lot of lessons to learn from Colaba as well in the way it was built. So a few points I would like to share today in relation to our topic. So as Jagan has mentioned, for India, there are huge infrastructure needs, especially in the global south. The World Bank recently estimated that 60% of the infrastructure we'll see by 2030 is yet to be built. And of course, we can guess that most of it is going to be built in the global south. So this leaves us a huge responsibility, because if we look at it, the decade in which we are living now and the infrastructure we are going to lay down is going to determine the quality of life we are going to have for decades to come, because infrastructure is not something you remove immediately if you're not happy with it. So we are building a heritage of the future that will determine the quality of our life. It's a very important decade in here. Now, at the same time, there are huge needs in the global south, which are rapid development, because infrastructure is not in place, is not laid out, because populations are growing, because cities are growing exponentially, and there are huge housing needs. So on the one hand, we have this pressure on building the infrastructure. On the other hand, the way we are doing it is not really working well, because we are seeing that this triggers climate change effects, and there are a number of papers and projects I've been part of where we can demonstrate pretty scientifically that the same climate parameters do not have the same effects on cities. If you look at Singapore, it's almost never flooded. But if you look at Jakarta, if you look at Bangkok, if you look at Mumbai, floods are constant issues, with being more or less, same kind of, climates, which are comparable. So, so we are in a situation where we need to take alternative decisions. So essentially, we come to a point where we need somehow to find a way of reconciling building fast and affordable, because that's a real need we can't deny, with building sustainable and livable, because this kind of a need, we also understand it is there, but we usually tend to address the first need only. And this comes to 2 points, which is how do we build anew? What are the decisions we are taking when we are building? And how do we integrate the new infrastructure into the existing urban fabric? For example, how do we integrate it with our heritage assets? How do we also repurpose the existing infrastructure when it does not no longer feels the uses that we initially thought for them? For example, even if you look at the pandemic and all the offices that are no longer in use or hardly in use, what do we do with all this infrastructure? What do we do with the abandoned industrial areas that no longer fulfill their purposes? If we start demolishing everything, this is also a very heavy carbon footprint that we are going to face here. So how do we repurpose? That's also an important point. And so here, and I'll conclude with this kind of a thought, here, what we need in my practice, over working with really a number of cities across Asia, I think about 25 cities I've directly worked with. So essentially, I feel the solution lies into bringing together the learnings from the local context, rather than just building uniform, and with the same approach, no matter how the city is, with the power of the technologies which can upscale and help us address the need of building fast and affordable. So, and that can go into 3 different levels. The first level is the level of the building. So, for example, a very important question is what kind of materials we use. We all know that the conventional materials, the steel, glass, concrete, cement, has a very heavy carbon footprint. In fact, a recent report I've seen, the UNEP report, says that only the manufacturing of these materials costs us 11% of global CO2 emissions. So we don't target dedicatedly enough as yet the construction sector, but this needs to happen. And there are alternatives in which, so UNICITI is also a think tank, so we do look at different solutions. So we've associated with experts working into how we can upscale alternative materials. For example, earth-based materials, for example, timber-based materials, with the huge potential that bamboo has in Asia and in tropical countries in general. Looking at passive design techniques, how much energy can we save when we plan buildings in a way that there is natural cooling happening in the building and in the neighborhood. So the first level is the building. The second level is the neighborhood and the city level. Here again, there are a number of planning, passive design techniques, again, how does the wind flow? How can it cool my city more naturally? How do we integrate climate change into planning? So the second speaker mentioned, Lubaina mentioned nature-based solutions. So indeed, and often we'll come to the point of financing, I guess, in a bit, but often we don't even need the huge money. Sometimes it comes to just protecting a natural area at the planning level and say this is prohibited from encroachment, this is prohibited from construction, and let it play its role. This also can make a huge difference. Making human scale cities. You know that recently, just a couple of weeks ago, I saw that China officially prohibited super high rises. It limited the construction depending on how many inhabitants are in the city. And that came from, hard learning, where they have a number of ghost cities where no one lives in. So they learned from their own mistakes, and I trust that many Asian countries can learn from, other countries' mistakes and just, leapfrog that kind of a situation. And finally, to activate these two levels, the third level is policies and economic and financial models that support these alternatives. For example, if I want to build with bamboo, in many countries, regulations, building codes don't allow me to do it that easily. Even if I use cross-laminated bamboo, even if I have technical proof that it is fire safe and that you can build a certain number of floors. In the Canadian building code, for example, it is officially allowed to build up to 12 stories high with timber. It's already been demonstrated that you can build high rises with it. Tokyo is currently doing it with W350, I believe, building happening. But in many Asian countries, India does have inclusion of bamboo actually, but not so that it can be used at scale in cities. So definitely looking at alternative policies and I land there, very importantly, looking at financial and economic models that already incentivize private developers while policies are not yet in place. So in the Western countries, we can rely on policies because they usually come in, you can say, more timely. But in most Asian countries, it is a very long process to have a policy in place. So we don't have this much time to wait. So it's very important to identify what financial mechanisms already make sense to the developer. For example, typically, I'm currently in the United Arab Emirates. And so here developers learned very well that if you provide a nice public place around your building gains in value. So of course, the economical logic is different, incomes are different here. But nevertheless, there are ways in which we can identify for private developers incentives to build differently, which makes sense to them and which makes sense to the citizens as well. So a very important point to look at, and I'll end here for the moment.
Thank you, Olga. And finally, we turn to Dholakia, who is a lead specialist in research at the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which of course is the international grouping looking at questions of resilience and financing when it comes to infrastructure in many countries across the world. And Haim, take it away.
Thank you so much, Mihir, for the kind introduction, and it's a great honor to be part of this distinguished panel. I actually echo a lot of what my panelists have already shared, whether it's to do with the vulnerability and the social justice challenges that Jagan spoke about, the issues of governance, which Lubaina referred to, as well as the need for design thinking that we need to bring in our policy and regulatory frameworks that Olga was referring to. The point that I'd like to make is that all this new infrastructure that is currently there and is likely to be built is going to be, vulnerable to climate and disasters. So how do we build resilient from the get-go? That's really the question, and that's the question that even we at CDRI deal with. I'd like to make 2 points in this regard. What we are likely to see is a future where there is deeper integration, even across infrastructure sectors. So, for example, if you think about electric vehicles, you're already talking about a deeper integration between electricity and the transportation sector. If you talk about, a future where we are going to be traveling in cars that are actually fueled by hydrogen, then this is the kind of new infrastructure which is actually yet to be built. And it may look very, very different from the petrol stations and the gas stations that we have today. So what does resilience really mean for this new infrastructure that is going to be built? The second point that I want to bring to is around people's participation. So if we look at cities today, and if we look at municipal corporations today, they're encouraging societies to be actors when it comes to solid waste management, when it comes to rainwater harvesting. And if we talk about a decentralized renewable energy future, we'll have a lot of people who would be installing solar panels, say, on their rooftops. So how do we get these people to become agents of change, agents of resilience, as we look at, the future of cities? I'd just like to end by, touching upon the question around finance, that if there are so many of these projects, whether these are small projects that individuals will take up, or whether these are the large national infrastructure pipeline projects that state and central governments would take up. How do we ensure that we are pricing physical, climate, and disaster risk as part of all these investment decisions? So I'll, pause here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Him. And I think that we'll be returning again to some of those points in our discussion over the next few minutes. But I want to now sort of maybe take it around, ask a couple of follow-up questions, and see if anybody has any responses to what has been said already. And I'll start with you, Jagan. I want you to, and of course, Him has mentioned this just now as well, but I'd like you to expand on your thought about risk mitigation, risk management, and how central that is for urban governance in India and in the emerging world, if it wants to get the private sector engaged at scale in some of the infrastructure projects we're thinking about.
Well, Mihir, I think that's a rhetorical question. It's highly important, obviously. I think what we have now experienced over the last 2 years is a heightened awareness of risk, and in some senses, we need to see that as an opportunity. Although the risk is focused a lot on public health risk, but having said that, what it does do is highlight the importance of at least one very important public infrastructure, which is meant for public health. So we should see this as an opportunity because throughout the history of urban planning as well and urban management, public health disasters have actually been sort of exacerbating phenomena. Whether you look at the most famous, of course, the cholera epidemics and so on, but also importantly, we saw a number of public health issues before independence, which led to one of the most pivotal studies that was done during sort of the final years of the British Raj, called the Bohr Committee, and which brought out a 3-volume report in 1946, which forms pretty much the tenets of, and one might even say, the somewhat outdated dogma of urban planning in India. So, I think the important thing is that risk is also a window to understanding problems. So there is a risk-informed thinking. And I think we need to adopt that across the board, not just in infrastructure design and finance and planning, but to look at the world through the window of risk. Because fundamentally, for a country like India, which has such a large number of poor and vulnerable population, risk is the window through which they look at, the lens through which they look at the world. So, in a sense, to see the world through that lens gives you a much sharper picture of what the sort of the reality of the Indian city is about. I think the second point that I would like to make is that this is the era of impact finance. So if you're looking at private sector investment, let's also not look at private sector investment as coming in dribs and drabs, but actually coming in large, sort of bulky investments, which help us to solve big, hairy problems, right? So, I mean, whether it is sanitation, which of course the Swachh Bharat mission has tried to address, but there are so many others. Housing, for instance. Why can't we, in a short period of time, take care of homelessness and poor quality housing in this country? That's where the attraction for the private finance is also growing. People want to make big bets from the private sector as well. Because ultimately, if you're not contributing to solving those hairy problems, then you're creating another pilot. And I think there's a kind of fatigue with any kind of pilots and demonstration projects unless they are linked to achieving scale. I want to end with one point, which is a bit of a pet peeve, and I do want to flag it, which is that we tend to talk about the future of cities as being somewhat outside of our existing cities. Cities are evolutionary in nature, by very nature. Even greenfield cities, if you look at them, essentially they're evolving from a particular matrix into an urban space. So understanding the city as a place of history is really important. And this links to risk, because very often what happens is that risk is measured only at a point of time and doesn't take into account accumulated risk that comes in. So take housing, for example. If you were to replace all of the workers' housing in Mumbai, say all the chawls, yes, you're doing that, but keep in mind that there is a risk of complete displacement of populations unless your location of new housing is also at the same place. And we find that in public housing everywhere. Location matters. And if you don't take that into account, you face the risk of people actually rejecting the housing, right? So I think getting a far more granular and a more nuanced understanding of risk is fundamental to solving this finance problem. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Jagan. I think there's a lot of food for thought in those remarks. But I want to pick up on one thing that you said, which I will paraphrase poorly, as noting that the pandemic revealed and in some cases exacerbated design flaws in aspects of our cities that maybe we need to address. And Lubaina, if I may sort of mention that. I read some time ago an absolutely a very revealing blog post written by you and some colleagues at WRI when we were going through the reopening process or the unlocking process in India after our lockdown last year, in which you pointed out that the design of public transport, and this goes back to some of the questions you just raised about public spaces and livability, but the design of public transport in India, particularly suburban rail stations in Mumbai, doesn't take into account, physical distancing. And obviously, you don't think it's important at most times, but it became very vitally important last year. It may continue to be important for some time to the foreseeable future. But it also impacts livability, usability, inclusion, and all these things that we have maybe been putting on the back burner for too long. So I just want to, and this links up with the point that Jagan was making about big bets. Is there some sense in a post-pandemic world that we can think about questions of livability, of distance, and management of our cities in a different way? Can we have a big bet paradigm introduced?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think, I mean, as I was saying, and the work that you're talking about, the blog that you're talking about, was actually kind of also stemmed from the failure of one footover bridge that had happened maybe 3 years ago at Elphinstone Station, which is now Prabha Devi. And the idea of how much crowd can we actually take in our cities, and how sort of like this kind of tenuous nature of risk that we're constantly living with, and when does it sort of, you know, break and become this kind of disaster? And a lot of what are, I mean, through the pandemic, a lot of what we've been able to do is reflect on some of these systems that have been crumbling a long time ago, but we've been able to kind of, you know, overlook. And I think what Jagan was talking about, the idea of articulating big bet funding and impact funding to some of these very critical needs, you know, and even, I mean, even when you look at it from a disaster risk reduction point of view, or some of the, I mean, even for the climate action plan, for example, we're looking at some of these areas of decarbonizing the transportation sector, for example, and a lot of attention then immediately moves to electric mobility and electric mobility then, or clean fuels for private cars. But we completely miss the entire picture around so much of Mumbai actually travels through public transport and through integrated mobility, integrated paratrans. I forget the word. IPT, the auto rickshaws, taxis. So what does that just transition look like, you know, from an infrastructure point of view? If you're just constantly thinking about how to clean the sort of private sector, the private vehicle ridership, and just focusing sort of on that sector, which is pretty much about 5 to 10% of our ridership, what is the sort of bigger kind of chunk of really looking at decarbonizing on-road transport in these sectors? So I think there's definitely a lot more kind of space needed to articulate how some of these bigger public services can be kind of provided for. A lot of what we are also sort of covering on the water sanitation side, you know, there are so many, that there is a huge on in terms of sanitation numbers, you know, 60% of less than maybe actually 60% of the city actually do not even have access to safe sanitation in the city. And these are just numbers from 10 years ago. We don't even have the kind of data in terms of how how poorly our kind of hygiene and public health is experienced at this point of time, you know, 10 years later, and sort of waiting for the census data to kind of help inform some of these very important conversations, which through last year, a lot of the focus was on, you know, talking about health and hygiene from a water and sanitation point of view, but we don't even have the kind of data and understanding of the problem in some of the informal settlements. What we also have been sort of realizing is that, you know, 50% of our city live in informal housing, but our only kind of solution to thinking about that problem is rehabilitation, which really the city cannot handle anymore. You know, we can't, because when you think again about what Olga also was talking about, the need to integrate passive design and integrate energy efficiency in new buildings. But when you think about, when you actually see the kind of slum rehabilitation buildings that are being built, and the kinds of projects that are coming up in low-income housing and affordable housing sector, they're not at all kind of at par with a lot of thinking that we're trying to integrate into the housing sector, the building sector, from an energy efficiency point of view. You know, green building norms and certifications are largely targeted towards higher and upper middle class housing or commercial establishments. So I think these are some of the, I mean, really sort of thinking about how to open up the public infrastructure and the public services sectors towards big bet financing is really, I think, a critical need to be able to meet some of the mitigation and adaptation targets that, you know, our cities and our plans are kind of aiming towards, and Mumbai specifically, you know. since such a large population of our city actually lives in underserved areas, so if we actually want to meet this supply gap and meet it in more sustainable and resilient ways, it will have to be with a lot more innovation and technology and a lot more dignity actually. And that's also part of the work that you cited it was also on how can we restore certain livability and quality of life standards, happiness in everyday transport. 7 million people using the trains every day, but in really life-threatening ways, and how can we restore some of these very basic sense of dignity in being able to live, work in the city. So yeah.
Thanks, Lubaina. And I think that question of dignity is centered in a lot of how we need to approach urban spaces going forward. I want to sort of, time is moving on, and I want to, in some sense, widen the discussion a bit. And Olga, you talked about in your earlier intervention, you talked about learning from each other. And one of the hopes of the Colaba Conversation in general is that we figure out that what's been working in India and try to broadcast it to the rest of the world. And we try and figure out what other emerging countries in particular are working out and working on, and whether we can incorporate that into our planning strategies and into our financing strategies. And is there some sense, do you get a sense that there is a new energy in this kind of knowledge sharing in the Indo-Pacific and across the emerging world? If not, how can we engage more effectively, subnational unit to subnational unit, city to city, planner to planner, and financer to financer, and try and get this done?
Thank you, Mihir. Quite a critical question. So unfortunately, I'm not sure the COVID times have been very, supportive of those kind of exchanges. So maybe this is, a bit of a more quiet time. Although on the other hand, we all learned to be online. For example, a number of cities and countries with which I would have never dreamt to have an online meeting. Suddenly, everyone was available, and they set up their electronic systems, and no one was traveling. So it did have its own positive side in terms of exchange. I come from a UN background, so I worked on a number of regional projects where we actually set up these exchanges, where cities would, in the frame of a project or a program, or just regular UN activities, would come together, and the idea would really be to share best practices, to share challenges. Does it work very well? It does to a good extent. It's absolutely essential that we give that ecosystem to learn from each other. Now, one drawback that I've noticed is that it seems to be difficult for cities to kind of take the learning and implement it automatically, because they learned of a practice. What I mean is that maybe here there is a role of also the international developing institutions, like be it the UN or be it NGOs or other institutions who work with the cities, to maybe translate the learnings into another local context. Because often, sometimes by lack of capacity, but much more often by just lack of time. If we take small and medium cities, which are, I think, if I remember well, 60% of Asia's urban population. Often you would just have maybe one or two urban planners. Sometimes you don't even have such a person. You have a few engineers. So it is a lot to ask them to, have this strategic thinking also, in addition to all the things that are already happening at their place. So maybe a way of further fostering these exchanges would be to work more closely with cities authorities on how to translate this lesson into the local context. For example, there is one policy in the Philippines which I absolutely love, which was put in place in 2015, which is that every city land use plan has to incorporate disaster risk reduction and climate change. So the Philippines learned it the hard way because they are, I think, the first or the second most hit country by typhoons, heavy rainfalls, etc. So it became a necessity as a result this policy came in, which was a great cooperation between the Ministry of Housing, I may not remember the exact name of ministry, but that's the kind of a portfolio, and the Ministry of Environment, where this policy was mainstream, guidelines were developed for cities on how to do that. And we start seeing results now. It's been 6 years that this policy is in place. So I find it's a great example, which too is from a developing country. So it would be very interesting to look into how this could be put in place in other countries. But you can't just transport it. You really need to see then which is the ministry responsible. For example, if you take the Indian case, I haven't come across anything more complex than India. Despite I lived 10 years in India, there is still a lot to learn here. So what would be the right scheme to introduce such provisions for cities in the Indian context? I'm sure it would be something completely different. So this kind of thinking is critically important. And Mihir, if you allow me, I would like to just give a quick thought on what Jagan has said. Jagan mentioned a very important point on vulnerability and how do we account for it. So here, what I encounter is that very often vulnerability is addressed post factum. To give you an example, in Thailand, there is a very well set up fund, which is, like disaster repair fund. So if a city gets hit by a major flood, then they can launch in a day an application to this fund and they get money to repair the disaster effects. But the same city can spend 2-3 years trying to get some public funding to prevent these disasters from happening. So how do we activate that approach to vulnerability where we do it upfront rather than post factum, and what kind of policies and mechanisms we need to put in place? Also, in a context where municipal authorities, this is a critical point, actually have a short lifetime when you look at it. So in India, it's 5 years, in the Philippines, it's 3 years only. And when we talk about climate change, which I'm most familiar with, and related natural disasters, we are talking, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ahead, because the infrastructure we build now, we want it to survive for that time. And now you focus only on capital cost. So maybe you earn on capital cost, but obviously you lose a lot on the life cycle cost. But this, I haven't come even across so many good practices, even to be honest, in the developed world, in the Western world, which, where budgets are made based on life cycle costs. If some of the panelists want to share some of their experiences, I'd love to hear about it, because I feel these two are huge barriers, that, way of budgeting things on capital cost and on short term, and, short-term mandates, which obviously are democratic and not an issue in themselves, but are an issue when looking at something that needs
long-term, long horizon issues. Well, we're almost out of time, and so I'm going to turn to him for final remarks. And I'd love it if he focused in particular on that precise issue. How can we build in long-term thinking? Can private finance be induced? In fact, what kinds of private finance maybe do we need? Do we need long-term debt finance, which might force long-termism on us as planners? Once we, what are the mechanisms that we can put in place to get sustainability into our DNA in urbanism?
Thank you. So in terms of understanding the finance landscape, to begin with, I feel we actually need a shared language on risk, resilience, and finance, which needs to cut across all the different stakeholders, whether they be private financiers, governments, project implementers, or even consumers of infrastructure services. Having said that, I think there are a couple of steps to actually get to that point. Typically, one, when we can think of actually deepening markets. So there are some markets where we talk about, though they are in the stage of awareness, they'll talk about, are they green climate bonds or resilience bonds? Then there are others where you have the regulatory frameworks in place. So they are at a slightly more advanced stage. And then you have markets where such instruments have actually been deployed and it has helped to develop credibility of investors, and that then pushes the market further. So that is one way of going about it, and building in private finance into this. The other is to actually ensure that we have the regulatory frameworks to actually leverage private finance. And this could be done in multiple ways. It could be done through having prioritization tools that governments can look at when they actually plan infrastructure, looking at different models of governance, and instruments such as long-term debt, as you had rightly alluded to. So I think we really need a combination of all of this to get to the goal where every single rupee or every single dollar that we put in from this day on helps to build sustainable and resilient infrastructure for decades to come.
Thank you, Haim. And I think that there's no better note on which to end than that. And I want to thank all my panelists today, Jagan, Lubaina, Olga, and Haim, for very on-point interventions and for keeping to time and for being brisk. And yes, to sum up, we will be building the infrastructure for the next decades in the next few years. We have to make sure that we build in resilience, we build in dignity, we build in justice, and we have to figure out how to finance them. And there are lessons that we can learn from each other, and there are lessons that we can learn from the rest of the world, and the rest of the world can learn from India on how this is being done. So thank you, all four of you, and thank you to the audience for listening, and thank you from the Colaba Conversation.